Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Hello, my name is Lynn O'Hara, and I'm the Director of Programs here at National History Day. We are very excited to be joining you for our second in a series of 5 Google Hangouts, in which we're focusing on the skills that our students need to transition from the research stage of the process into project creation. So first off, I want to say hello to everybody who's joining us tonight. We have 2 of our NHD affiliate coordinators who have nice enough to join us to help us answer some NHD questions. So we've got Maggie Mahan from NHD in Missouri and Millie Fries from NHD in Iowa with her t-shirt behind her. In addition, we are lucky enough to go ahead and have 2 schools joining us live. From Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, we have West Catholic High School. And from the North Shore of Oahu in Hawaii, we have Kahuku Elementary School. So we've got some 6th graders and we have some... Aloha, everyone. Welcome. So what our plan is for this evening is I'm going to next turn things over to Karen Kenton, who is our contact at the National Endowment for the Humanities. But what I want to mention is that throughout this hour, we know that many of you have gone ahead and sent us questions in your pre-registration. But we're also going to take questions live on Twitter. Use the hashtag NHD Hangouts. I'm watching the Twitter feed here, and our goal is to answer as many of those questions in the next hour as possible. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Karen Kenton at the NEH. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Lynn. Thank you. And thank you to all our guests and all our viewers tonight. We're very excited to have Sarah Colt with us, and I will introduce her in just a moment. But first, I'd like to say just a couple words about NEH. We're a federal agency that supports research, preservation, and education in the humanities. And we support a wide range of activities, such as books, websites, exhibitions, historical site interpretation, and documentaries. Do those categories sound familiar, NHD students? We have supported National History Day since its very founding. The agency continues to sponsor the first place medals. They're called NEH Scholar Medals at the national competition. And we offer a special prize across all History Day submission formats for use of Chronicling America, which is a database of over 8 million digitized historic newspaper pages, which are all keyword searchable. NEH's Incitement team offers a wide range of educational resources to support both Chronicling America and National History Day, such as searching techniques, lesson plans, and special features related to this year's NHD theme of leadership and legacy. So we are very fortunate tonight to have with us Sarah Colt. She's an award-winning filmmaker. She was the writer and director of Henry Ford, a film funded in part by NEH and broadcast on WGBH's American Experience, which is PBS's documentary series on American history. The biography Sarah crafted provides rich historical context and a complicated view of Ford, who rose to be one of the most influential American innovators of the 20th century. The documentary offers an incisive look at the birth of the American auto industry, with its long history of struggles between labor and management, and a thought-provoking reminder of how Ford's automobile forever changed the way we work, where we live, and our ideas about individuality, freedom, and possibility. Sarah is currently working to complete another NEH-funded film on the life and work of Walt Disney. Sarah will talk with us tonight about bringing history to life through words, and she'll provide insights on research, writing, and editing. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Sarah.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is such a pleasure and really quite exciting, so thank you. I wanted to start by just saying something about writing, and I think there's a real misconception that a lot of people have about writing, that somebody is either a good writer or they're a bad writer, that it's somehow some magical talent that you're born with or you're not born with. And what I would say about writing is that it is a muscle, and it's something that you have to strengthen and work on and just keep doing drafts, and you will get to be a better writer, and you will still be practicing as a writer until you are old and gray, which I'm sure is hard to imagine. But I wanted to start out by saying that because I think it's really easy to feel discouraged at times by how hard writing is, and I think you get better with practice. And so I wanted to just start with that message, and then I thought we would go right away to look at a clip from the film Henry Ford. And the reason I think it's a good way to start is it's really easy to read things like magazine articles and books and see documentaries and just think, oh, that just effortlessly came together. So I wanted to introduce this clip. This is a clip where we talk about Henry Ford's sense of his own celebrity and how he was going to use the power that he had gained from his success as an automobile maker. He had really quite big ideas as what he wanted to do with his success, and some of them made sense and some of them were quite misguided. And so I wanted to show you this clip, and then I thought after we watch it we can talk a little bit about how I got to this place with the film. So this is from the final version of the film. And it appears, just to set it up, it comes in the film in the second act of the film, and it comes after he's developed the Model T, the car that made him very famous and very wealthy and very powerful, and also instituted the $5 day, which was paying workers a better wage for the work they were doing in factories. So why don't we watch the clip? And it's going to stutter a bit, I think, so just be forewarned that because we're streaming on the web, it's not going to run as fluidly as it would if you were watching it on television.
Lots and lots of people in America and outside of America are fascinated by Henry Ford, and he, seemingly uninterested in money, is very interested in being in the public spotlight.
A few months after his $5 day announcement, Ford established his own moving picture department. Its first production, How Henry Ford Makes 1,000 Cars a Day, was released that summer in movie theaters across the country.
Henry Ford was not bashful about self-promotion. I mean, in many ways, he's the king of it. And, you know, film is another way to promote himself.
Journalists fell for the carefully crafted message. Henry Ford was one of the richest men in the world, the press reported, but money had not changed him. He still loved nothing more than a home-cooked meal and an afternoon working on his farm. He was a genius inventor with simple tastes, despite his dramatic success. There is not much outward difference between Ford and his workmen, a reporter for the Evening World wrote. He is just the hard-working mechanical genius that he was 10 or 20 years ago. Cameras captured him with movie stars, politicians, and celebrities, like aviator Charles Lindbergh and Helen Keller. His idol, the inventor Thomas Edison, embraced Ford as a friend and fellow visionary.
Ford recognizes that he himself is being transformed from a big-time player in the automobile industry to just a big-time player.
He begins to believe the headlines. Henry Ford, the great man. Henry Ford, the folk hero. Henry Ford changing the world. He soaks all of that in, this farm boy from Dearborn, Michigan, and he begins to believe that stuff.
Many of the men who worked for Ford were well aware of their boss's growing ego, and one story in particular served as a warning to anyone who might challenge him. During a summer when Ford was in Europe, his team had built a prototype for a new car. A successor to the Model T, they believed, was long overdue.
Ford comes in unannounced. He walks around the car several times, opens the door on the passenger side, literally rips it off the hinges. He walks around to the other side, rips the door off the driver's side, and he proceeded to demolish the car by hand.
The message was clear. Henry Ford, and no one else, was in charge.
Sarah, thanks for showing us that. I think that's a great way to kind of get started in thinking about writing, because one of the secrets about NHD is that all NHD students, regardless of project type, start off as writers. So whether you're writing for a paper or a performance or a documentary, it really doesn't matter. So can you tell us a little bit about what you enjoy writing for documentaries? What's the best part?
Well, I have to say that, and this may the best part is actually when you finally get to that place where what you've written is really working, and it can make you, for me, because I'm working on documentaries, my writing starts out on the page, and it's very much for, on the page and for people to read, and then it comes to life in the edit room with picture and interviews and music and sound. And so for me, the greatest moment is when you finally start to see that coming together, and your writing becomes much more spare, and you don't have to say as much necessarily because you have all these elements at play. So I have to say the worst part of writing for me is the blank page. It's the beginning. And I have some thoughts about how to help with that. But that's my answer, is really I love the end. I love when it just starts to come together.
Excellent. Can you talk a little bit about kind of starting with that blank page and the challenges? That it's one thing to have an idea, but a lot of times students, get the idea that they're going to write, and they sit with that blank piece of paper, that blank computer screen, and they're not sure where to start. Can you give some kind of tips and strategies if you get stuck at that point?
Well, I think that the mistake, and it's an easy thing to do, and I do it, is to think that you're ready to start writing when you're not. And so I really think that doing your research and really understanding what it is that you want to say, and so if that entails talking to people, interviewing people, reading, watching, movies, watching documentaries, really understanding your subject, that's a really important thing to do before you actually start to write. And then I think it's critical that you don't think that you're going to write the whole thing in one sitting, that you actually that writing an outline and writing out your argument, sort of what it is that you want to say in a couple of sentences, and then an outline is just so key to helping with the blank page problem. And then the final thing that I would say is that for me, and this is, everybody has to figure out their own ways of doing things, but for me, I really like talking, and I really like hashing out ideas with somebody else, and so I often rely on a colleague who doesn't necessarily know a lot about what I'm writing about, but is a good writer and understands how to tell a good story. And I find that bouncing ideas off of somebody, a friend, a colleague, a teacher, whoever it is, it can be really helpful in the process of figuring out what you're going to write.
Can I ask you to kind of step back for a second? You mentioned that, all of this has to start with research. And a lot of our students at this point have a good amount of research. They know a lot about the leader that they're writing about. But can you talk about how you transition from the research and the facts into the writing piece?
Well, I think that the key thing, and I'll use Henry Ford as an example. So Henry Ford is this famous person who a lot of people know the basics about what he did and who he was. And so you could do an encyclopedic description of who Henry Ford was in a documentary, but it's not going to keep people's interest. You've got to be able to come up with your own take, your own idea, your own argument about what do you want to say about Henry Ford, just using Henry Ford as an example. And so you have to decide, well, is it important where he was born? Is it important when he was born? Well, I'll say that one of the things that was critical about Henry Ford to me, having done a lot of research, was that here was a man born during the Civil War in the 19th century, who then moves into the 20th century and in some ways helps to invent what we understand as the 20th century. But Henry Ford himself as a person was really torn between sort of, I often thought about it as he had one foot in the 19th century and one foot in the 20th century. So that would argue if that's something I'm interested in, then it's important that we know when he was born. And so just using that as an example is that when you know what you want to say in terms of an argument, then it helps you to pick what you're going to include in your essay or your documentary or your script, whatever it is that you're writing.
Can you talk a little bit about when you're writing for different forms of media? Because there are stylistic differences between, let's say, a research paper versus a website versus a documentary or a dramatic performance, or even I think our toughest writing assignment is always our exhibits, where students are limited to 500 words. But can you talk a little bit about the process of writing for these different forms of media and some things that you might approach differently based on what you want your end product to be?
Well, I'll use the process by which I made the Henry Ford documentary as an example, because a critical piece of the Henry Ford film, it would not have been made without the NEH and the support of the NEH. And so we did 2 rounds of proposals for this film, and I was not I really was heavily involved in the second round of the proposal. And so when you're writing an NEH proposal, that's very much an, it's, you know, on paper. There are a few visuals that you might include as an appendix, but it's really something that somebody has to be able to read and understand. So you really flesh out your ideas. You include a lot more writing than you're actually going to use in the final documentary, because it's an academic piece. It's something that scholars and other filmmakers are going to read, and you're arguing why you should make this film. So that's a much kind of, it's wordier, there are more examples, there's more, there are just more words throughout it. By the time you get to a multimedia piece like a documentary, you have so many different things that you can help you to tell your story. So it's not just the writing. But the writing, in some ways, I would argue that the writing has to be better and stronger when you have fewer words, because you have to be so clear and so direct. But you're also supported by, and just to use the clip as an example, you hear the interviewees. Those could be quotations in a paper. Those are people helping you argue your point. And then you heard music, and you hear sound effects, and you see pictures, and all of those things play into what you've written, and you have to make sure you're not repeating yourself in the writing, because if Henry Ford is on a train, you don't need to say he's on a train. If that's a way of giving an example in terms of a different format than if you're writing it on paper, you need to say Henry Ford arrives on a train. So that, I don't know if that addresses your question, but that would be my answer.
I think you bring up a really good point, that any piece of good history kind of goes beyond the encyclopedia or the book report. You're not just giving a series of facts about Henry Ford, but you're actually making an argument about him. And you kind of alluded to that when you talked about him having one foot in each century. Can you talk a little bit about how you put an argument into writing? And how do you shift something from just being a biography to something that really has a point of view? Because I think that's something a lot of our students struggle with, is putting their own voice into their writing.
Well, and I think that that's the thing. I mean, and it's such a sort of, it's slightly contradictory, but I do think that the stronger your argument and the more clear you are about your argument, the easier it is to write something. And so if you don't really know exactly what you're trying to say, you can end up writing a lot and spinning your wheels, and then you feel like, oh, this, I can't believe they're limiting my number of words, I have too much to say. But if you know exactly what you want to say, it helps you hone your argument. And I'm going to give 2 examples. One is I think that you really are going to be in good shape with a project when you can get yourself down to one sentence. And I'm going to use an example that's maybe going to seem sort of really dated to the students, but when Bill Clinton ran for president in 1992, the campaign, sort of internal campaign slogan was, "It's the economy, stupid." And that was, a very short sentence that helped Bill Clinton win the election and become president of the United States, because he was on message always going back to talking about the economy. And so I think that's a really helpful way to think about writing, is if you think, okay, what is it that I'm trying to say about whatever subject you have? And again, I'll use Henry Ford as an example. We ended up with kind of a tagline about Henry Ford, which took us a long time to get to, but it really was at the heart of what we were trying to say with the film, which was, the world he created, he longed to escape. So that sentence in itself allows you to know what your argument is and think about what you want to include. Of course, we're going to include that he was this visionary, that he created the Model T, that he did the $5 day, all of these accomplishments. But it's in the framework of this notion of a man who is a visionary, but he also has regrets. And so I think that is a way of helping to talk about it.
That's a really good point. And one thing students might want to think about is that no matter what topic you have, there's a chance that somebody else might come to that NHD contest with the same topic. But that your argument line is something that would separate out your research and your take on your particular leader from somebody else's. And, you know, those are unique, and it should be unique because that's your independent research and your independent thought coming through. Can you talk a little bit about conclusions? This is something that students, especially when they're writing papers, really struggle with because they have a tendency to come through as basically the first paragraph with a couple different words mixed in there. Can you talk about writing conclusions, and what are some ways that you can kind of think about that, or the way you approach it as a writer?
Well, I think conclusions are hard. I mean, that's probably the theme of what I'm saying tonight, is that all of this is hard, and it takes a lot of thought and a lot of work and a lot of kind of, I always say, hashing it out. You kind of really have to think things through. I think a conclusion is best when it leaves the person wanting more and wanting to know more about the subject that you've written about. And so in some ways I like to think of a conclusion as having in some even sort of a teaser, which is to introduce a new idea that's not way off topic, but is within the framework of the paper that you've written, but it gets the person who's read what you've written or watched your documentary to think, wow, I really want to know more about whether it's, you know, automobiles and how they changed the American landscape, or who Henry Ford was as a person, or, you know, what does control and power do to a person, and how did it affect Henry Ford? You know, sort of coming up with something that will throw the topic forward. That's what I would say about a good conclusion, is that you're taking it to a new level and you're hoping that your audience is going to want to learn more.
Excellent. I have one more question for you that I'm actually going to turn to our students in Hawaii for the next couple questions. But I wanted to ask you about revision process and deciding what to cut. Because one of the things that can be really tough for students when they've done work, when they've written a paragraph, sometimes when they've written a page, is that, you know, it's really hard to give up what they've created. And what are some things that maybe you had to cut, and what are ways that you think that helps your final product when you're open to those kind of revisions?
Well, I think it's really interesting because you do need to listen to how other people respond to your work. So if you've written a paper, get somebody to read it, and if they tell you they don't understand something, and you can't get them to understand it, that often means that it doesn't belong in what you're writing. I'm going to use as an example a scene that I just absolutely loved in the Henry Ford film, and it was about a very famous Mexican painter who came to Detroit in the years that Henry Ford was kind of at the height of his power, and the Mexican painter was named Diego Rivera, and he did these incredible murals of the assembly line process at the Ford plant. So it was it's an amazing story because the murals are really ridiculously beautiful, and they're in Detroit still to this day. But there was also footage of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo making these murals, and anyway, it just was I thought, this sort of fantastic scene. And I showed it to my executive producer, and he basically said, it doesn't feel relevant enough to the story you're trying to tell. And I was upset because I really thought it was wonderful. But he was right. It wasn't pushing forward my argument. It was sort of superfluous over to the side. It was perfectly pleasant and interesting, but it wasn't honing my argument, and therefore it didn't belong. And so I had to cut it, and that was really painful, but in the end, it was the right decision.
Excellent. That's a really good concrete example. What I'd like to do is turn things over to Kahuku Elementary. If you guys could go ahead and unmute yourself, we'd love to hear a couple questions from your students. Hi there. What's your question?
Can you talk about balance? I've been told to tell both sides of the story, but how do I make my point sound more important?
That's a really good question, because sometimes, especially when you're looking at developing these arguments, there's more than one side, and there's multiple, sides. Because sometimes when you look at leaders, there's some really good things they did. Sometimes there's some not so good things that they did. So, Sarah, can you talk a little bit about balance and balancing your argument?
Well, I think it's really important to make sure that you don't only tell one side of the story. So either you're making if it's a biography, you're making the person you're talking about just so wonderful that it's almost not possible. You have to be really sure that you're telling the full story. Or if you're talking about somebody that did some really bad things, you want to make sure that you understand the full person. I think balancing your argument partly has to do with how you feel about the person you're writing about. And if you come to a decision of what you think who that person was, that's going to help you make the decision of how to describe who they were. But it's important that you tell both sides. I think that's your job as a writer, and that's sort of a journalistic job that you have, to make sure that you are not looking at this person through rose-colored glasses because you just particularly love them or you think they're really fantastic.
It's a good question. What other questions do you guys have?
I have a question about plagiarism. If I get information from a website and put it in my own words, is that plagiarism? Do I need to say where I got the information?
That's a really good question. I'm actually going to pass this question off to a couple different of our experts. I'm actually going to have Millie Fries, our NHD and Iowa coordinator, talk about this, because this is something where there's a lot of students where they're getting information and they're struggling to figure out what they should and shouldn't cite. So Millie, can you talk a little bit about that from the NHD perspective, and then I'm going to pass it to Sarah to talk about how she credits the sources that she uses in her documentaries.
Hi, that is a great question. And if you're using a direct quote from a source, obviously you put it in quotation marks and you cite it, and to avoid plagiarism. Sometimes you'll take an idea from from a source, whether it's a website or a book or some document, and if the idea isn't something you could have come up with on your own, then you need to cite it. Even if you put it in your own words, you should have a general citation that gives credit to where this idea came from if it wasn't your own original idea.
And that's a really good question. And I always tell students that when in doubt, put the citation in, and then go ahead and review it with your teacher or your librarian, because it's always easier to say, okay, you know what, I've got too many, then I don't have enough. Sarah, can you talk a little bit about how you give credit to the sources that you use in your documentaries?
Well, I mean, we use quotations a lot, and we say who we're quoting in the narration. We also, when we finalize a film, I hire an outside person. I mean, this is on a level that's beyond a student level, but we fact check, and we're very, very thorough about fact checking, so that we have to have several secondary sources to prove a fact in order to feel comfortable to include it in the film, and that helps you to make sure that you're not either getting something wrong or plagiarizing. Like if something was word for word from a book, we're going to find it because we are going back and checking all the sources of what we've used. And we have these enormous fact check documents that go along with the documentation of our film, so that if anyone ever questioned it, we could look back and see where we got the facts. So I think that it's really, that's on a level that's a little bit different from being a student, but I do think what you're saying, Lynn, citing where you found the information. And then I would just say be really careful about websites, because you're not always sure. I mean, you have to be careful about which websites you use. And so I'm sure you guys all know that, but you can't trust Wikipedia. That Wikipedia is maybe a place to get some general knowledge, but it's not a place to use for your background on a paper or project.
Thanks, I really appreciate that. Kahuku, one other question for us. We'll try to get more in towards the end, but I just at least want to get 3. Go ahead.
Should the context be put in a separate paragraph?
Should the context
Should context be put in a separate paragraph? So this is a question. We actually have a similar one that was waiting for me earlier. How much background do you include? So in terms of where the person was born, when they were born, how much detail should you give, and should you put it in a separate paragraph? What would be your suggestion on that, Sarah? And I'm also going to pass that question off to Maggie as well.
I think that as much as you can incorporate that information within your story, and I say story, and I know that that might sound kind of strange because when you think story, you're thinking like of a fictional story that you read, but when we talk about history, we talk about telling the story, and you're figuring out what your story is. And so I think that as much as you can, if you're talking about when the person was born or who they were married to or if they had brothers and sisters, if you think it's important to your story, then incorporate it into the main body of the essay and don't make it just one separate paragraph standing on its own. That's my advice.
Great. Maggie, what would you say to that in terms of giving historical context? Because that's something paper writers struggle with sometimes.
Absolutely. Well, I definitely agree with Sarah because as she sort of talked about earlier, every word is sort of moving your argument forward, and how do these details about the context in which these leaders lived, how did that shape who they were, and that is all part of your story, so I think it all needs to be incorporated together because you can't separate that from the person you're talking about.
Well, I think that's a good time, too, to think about the Diego Rivera example. Is it really interesting, or does it help drive my argument forward? And I think that's a constant part of the revision process. Let's go ahead and turn things over to West Catholic. Do you guys have a couple questions for our experts tonight?
Hi, Joy. How do you approach the self-editing process of a paper?
How do you approach the self-editing process? If you're doing the first initial look, how do you self-edit?
That's a great question. Sarah, I'm going to let you take that one.
You know what? I think the best way to self-edit is to make sure you give yourself enough time. So I can remember as a student sometimes writing papers so at the last minute that when I read them over, it was kind of too late to even judge anything. And so I think writing, and this is something I do with my work and have to do in order to get my documentaries finished within the budget and schedule that I have, is I have to write a schedule. And so I would highly recommend writing a draft and then going to sleep on it. Let it sit for even a day or two and then go back to it. And I think you'll be amazed at how many sort of things you see, and you see it differently, and your self-editing process, I think, will become much easier if you do that.
I'm going to throw one other tip out there, and this is going to seem silly, but read it aloud. Go to the mirror. It's going to feel really, really stupid, but when we read aloud, it forces us to slow down because we can all read faster in our heads, and sometimes that helps let you catch things. Maggie, did you have a quick thing to add there? Quick tip?
Oh, Lynn, actually, I was going to say exactly what you just said, that the best way that I self-edit is to read aloud.
Excellent. West Catholic, another question for our experts.
How do you choose the photos
And documents.
and documents for your paper?
How do you choose the right documents, the right photos to include in both, whether it's the documentary or the paper, to kind of move your point along?
That's a great question because honestly, primary sources are at the root of historical research. So I'm actually going to toss this out. I'm going to start with Sarah and I'm also going to turn it to Millie. How do you choose primary sources, but also make sure that they don't kind of take over your project to the point that we lose your voice and we hear somebody else's?
I mean, it's such a good question, and it's, I mean, in some ways the answer in a way is practice, and I know I keep saying practice, but I think it's getting comfortable with sort of your own gut and knowing what is the best material for the argument that you're trying to make. So to use the documentaries as an example, as you saw, you know, we use lots of archival photographs and archival footage. And so it really gets down to good research. So I spent a lot of time gathering all that material and watching it. And then you just start making selects and choosing your favorite images, your favorite footage. And so that's the same way with quotes. It's like primary source quotes about the the leader or that you're working on, you're going to get, I would gather a lot of quotes and then read through them and start highlighting the ones you like best, and then read through them again and do another edit and come down to the ones that just really hit you as the best material to help you with your argument.
Great. Millie, what tips can you throw students about thinking about the primary sources in their writing?
When you're using the primary sources in writing a historical paper, obviously documents and quotes are going to be highly useful because you're using a written format. So find the quotes and the documents that move your point along, that underscore the message, the argument that you're making. With images, it's a little challenging because in a historical paper, images are supposed to go in the appendices, and appendices aren't required. Sometimes they're helpful, but sometimes it just makes the paper much thicker. Think about if the image really helps tell the story in a way that it's required to be there. For example, if you were doing a paper on food administration during World War I and rationing, and you describe how the government used propaganda posters to influence people's actions during World War I time, you might want to include a couple of good examples of those posters in an appendices, because those posters are going to tell a compelling story in a way that just describing them on paper can't. So you find the images that really help you tell the story, use them when they're really important in a historical paper, and make sure that they help move the story along and that they're important to be there and not just padding that makes the paper thicker in the end.
I think that's a really good point you make about being really selective, because if you use a topic like this, there literally could be hundreds of examples.
Right.
But choosing the 2 or 3 that really drive home your point can be really effective.
And as a paper judge, I appreciate it when students give me a package that everything in there is necessary in there. If I have to wade through a lot of unnecessary stuff, it's going to dilute my understanding of that paper and its impact. So being really selective shows me that you have solidified your argument, you know what you're trying to say, and you're doing it in the best possible format for a paper writer.
Excellent. Here's a question. Actually, I'm going to go one more question from West Catholic, then I'm going to go with a good question on the Twitter feed to toss out there.
Okay. How do you find the opposing side's information? Do you have any places that people can use to find other sides' information, since that's one of the hardest things to find?
That's a really good question. The idea of trying to have your research balanced, to have more than one point of view. What are some tips, or what are some things that you find helpful in trying to balance out your research, Sarah?
I mean, what I do in my work, is read a lot of things, but then talk to people, and I actually think that helps a lot. And I'm not sure if that's relevant for the projects you are all working on, but I think as much as you can is to really make sure you're seeing all sides to a story. So finding the magazine article that was written by the either conservative magazine or the really liberal magazine about, the president that you're writing about, that would help you a lot to understand how different people saw that leader differently. And it's so important to do that. You may not end up using that material, but it'll help you have a better understanding of who the person that you're writing about is.
That's a really good point. Now, one of the things, we've got a lot of questions, and one of the things, I think this is an interesting Twitter question, and the student asked, should we include bias in our script writing? And can we talk a little bit about the difference between bias, but then also historical interpretation, because I think sometimes students kind of mix up the two. So I'm actually going to toss that to Maggie first, and then I'm going to ask Sarah to kind of answer that from your perspective. How do you balance out having an opinion versus having a historical interpretation?
Absolutely. Well, as far as having an opinion and making your argument, I always think of this as you're entering a conversation, that whatever you say, you always have to anticipate what someone else is going to say, and whether they're on the same page as you or whether the opposing argument, and being ready to anticipate those viewpoints and address them in your argument as you move forward. And so that is looking at things with a critical eye, with historical interpretation, and then I think just sort of being aware of any bias that you might bring personally, that because I'm a woman, because I'm white, that there are certain, because I'm college educated, there are certain things that I might bring into my vision, and just being aware of those cultural circumstances as I'm going through research.
Great. Sarah, how do you look at historical interpretation and bias?
Well, I mean, I think that, and I think in a way, Maggie just brought this up, that in some ways we all have bias, and there's no such thing as a fully objective interpretation of anything. And I think that it's really important to be aware of that. I think that point of view is the key thing, and feeling comfortable that it's okay to make an argument without being, horribly biased. So I mean, it's a little complicated in that way, because I think you are going to have your own point of view because you can't have anyone else's, but you do the best you can to know the material and understand the material. For example, on a film like Henry Ford, I worked very closely with academic advisors, and they were, scholars who understood the material way more than I did. They spent years and years reading primary source material about Henry Ford. I read their books, and so I could talk to them and see if my interpretation of something made sense in the historical context, and that helps a lot in terms of bias or in just getting going down the wrong road with things. For students, that may not be as practical, but you have your teachers who can help you and get advice as much as you can, and I think that that's important to listen to that advice.
Great. I'm going to go to a couple questions now. Some of these are from our students when they registered, and some of them are live on Twitter. Keep in mind, anybody who's watching can tweet me a question. Use the hashtag NHD Hangouts, and I'll get those, and we'll get as many of them asked live as possible. Millie, I'm going to toss this question for you. Many students ask questions about formatting the paper and whether they should use parenthetical references or footnotes. Can you talk about formatting the NHD paper properly and what options students have?
All right, formatting the paper properly. First, we'll put a plug in for the rule book, because the rule book does have a sample page that can show you exactly what a page could look like. When you're formatting your paper, you have to first choose, are you going to use footnotes or in-text parenthetical citations? Please choose one style or the other. Maybe your school prefers MLA and that's what you're going to use. Be consistent throughout. If you prefer the Turabian manual and going with footnotes, just be consistent throughout. Keep in mind, if you do use parenthetical citations, you may have to hand count the words in your paper in order not to include a count of the citations as part of your word count. Some just basic things on format. Remember, your title page should be just the title of the paper and your name, your division, your category, just that information, no fancy binders, and make sure you staple it neatly. One of my pet peeves as a paper judge is when I get a paper where the staple doesn't go clear through and all the pages are falling off the back, and it's not my job to keep your paper in order. So from the little things like having it stapled in the upper left-hand corner so that it stays together, to making sure you've got your title page with just the information NHD requires, and then use the style guide, either MLA or Turabian, to make sure that your paper is in the correct format.
Excellent, thank you. Some of the things that students asked is, what are the most common writing mistakes that you see? So I'm actually going to toss this question first to Sarah, then to Maggie. When you look at either your writing or your colleagues' writing, what are some easy ways that students can improve their writing in the editing process?
Well, I think a really one that's so important, and I still struggle with it at times, is writing in an active verbs and rather than passive. And so making sure that you are doing, I mean, that's just a really key thing. I also think is making sure that you're not using lots of extra words for no reason, that you're being as direct and clear as you can with what you want to say. And if you read the sentence and it's a long sentence, say to yourself, well, what is it that I'm really trying to say with this sentence? And oftentimes you can cut that sentence down by a lot.
Excellent. Maggie, what are your thoughts here? What are some common mistakes that you see?
Absolutely. Well, as Sarah pointed out, I think students really need to focus on using active verbs, that instead of saying something like, the painting was created by, you could just say, so-and-so painted whatever they did. One, that will be much more direct. Two, that will cut down on your words, and as Sarah said very early on in our conversation this evening, you're wanting to get to a point where your writing is spare, where you take out everything that is not important and effective, everything that's not moving your argument forward. And so using those action verbs will help you be concise, will help you be specific, and will help you weed out some of those extra words. This is a basic thing, but just make sure that you spell check and make sure that you actually spell check and not just your computer, just because when you know, it happens to everyone, but when you see those typos, it just lends an error that this isn't a professional piece and you really want it to be as polished as you possibly can.
Always important. In terms of writing mistakes, I'm going to add one other tip. Sometimes, especially when students are doing a quote in a paper, they do what I used to call as a teacher, I'd call it dropping a bomb. You drop the quote in there and you leave it be, and there's just a big block quote in the middle of the page. And I think it's important for, if you're going to use a primary source quote, to then analyze it, to say why it's important. And I want to see, Sarah, can you talk a little bit about what you think makes quality analysis? So not just telling me the quote that Henry Ford said, but why it's important, and how do you transition that into your writing?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's really, I mean, I feel like I'm a little bit of a broken record, but I do think it goes back to your argument and what story you're trying to tell. And so you use a quote that is going to further your story. And so you want to use the quote, place it in the right location so that it has the most impact on your reader or on your audience. And I mean, we, in the process of a historical documentary, we really use interviewees, the people, you know, you saw them in the clip, talking about the subject to help us analyze things. But as a writer, you can do that on paper much better than we can do in a film. And that's important to recognize, that you should tease apart a primary source quote and really explain what it means and why you're including it and why it's important.
Great. Millie, here's another student question. When you're citing your sources, whether you're using footnotes or the parenthetical citations, how much is too much? Because I think we've all seen those papers, and can you talk a little bit from the perspective of a papers judge that maybe when you need to start backing off?
All right. Well, if your footnote is half a page long, it's too much. Don't use a footnote to get around the word count to be able to include a lot more information. Use a footnote specifically to cite a source. Where did you get this information? What's the document? What's the repository? Where did it come from? If you need a little bit of explanation, maybe a term is outdated or something we don't use anymore, or you just need a little bit of an explanation to help it make sense, you can put that information in a footnote, but keep it brief, because the goal of a footnote is not to get around the word count. It's just to show where the information came from.
That's a good point. I think this is one of those times where peer editing and showing people your paper can be really helpful. Exactly. Sarah, here's another student question for you. I thought this was a great question that came in earlier today. How should you be drawing your own conclusion in history, or should you be summarizing the conclusions of others? What's your take on that?
That's such a, I mean, that's a hard question. I think, you know, you really, you are being a historian yourself, writing a paper, because you're reading primary source materials, you're reading analysis, and you're coming up with your own argument. So in a way, I think it's important to recognize that you are making your own analysis, but it's very much instructed by other people's arguments and evidence. And so I think as long as your paper is including plenty of evidence to argue your point, then you can be the one that makes, you know, you're being a historian writing this essay. That's what historians do. So I think it's, you know, you should be able to say what you think. And I mean, it has to be backed up by evidence. You can't just say something, but as long as it's backed up by evidence, I think that's what you're doing, and that's the exciting thing that you're doing.
I think that's what makes real history different than just report writing, and that's what I think makes History Day exciting, because you never know where that evidence is going to lead you. What I'm going to do, actually, Maggie, quick question, student question for you. Can you or should you use subtitles inside of a paper? Think of these as like section headings or chapter headings.
I think as you are drafting your paper, if that's a way to help you keep your information organized and help you move your argument along, I think it can be a useful tool. But I think, as Sarah talked about, you think about your paper as an entire story, as an entire argument. And so even though you're using specifics in terms of your evidence, you're not, it's all part of your thesis of the story, and so it's not these concrete pieces that are disconnected. So I think once you work through this, you could take them out and have your complete piece.
Excellent. And keep in mind, part of NHD is editing. Students can edit before they enter a regional contest, before they go to an affiliate contest, and if they get lucky enough to come see us at the national contest at the University of Maryland at College Park, I absolutely encourage you to go ahead and edit. We think our Hawaii students think they're coming this year. I would love to have them come. Let me ask a question, Millie, another student question here. What separates a great paper from a good paper? And what's more important? Is it content? Or is it good writing, or is it a little bit of both?
I think it's a little bit of both. What I'm looking for in a great paper is a compelling story. Sarah talked a lot about developing your story. I want to learn something from your paper, so there's the content. The good writing comes in and how you tell it. Use that active voice. Select your evidence and quote your primary sources with skill and with thought to what's going to make your point and prove your argument. Just really tell us a compelling story, and that'll be the magic of the content and the good writing coming together. And I really did like Sarah's point that writing is something. It's like a muscle. You've got to exercise it. Don't be afraid that your first draft isn't perfect, because nobody's first draft is perfect. You'll go through lots of drafts. And the other thing that will make a really great paper is you're always writing with the idea of the word count, 2,500 words. It goes quickly once you get started telling your story. Don't watch the word count and simply quit when you get to 2,499 words, because you may not have told the best part of the story yet or developed a really good conclusion. Make sure you write the story you need to write, and then use that editing to go back and figure out what scenes can I eliminate and how can I make this a stronger paper. But don't just stop when you get to 2,500 words, or you might miss the best point of all.
Excellent, thanks. And Sarah, I have to ask you, I'm going to break one of my rules here. I usually don't ask student-specific content questions, but 2 student groups got in touch with me today, and it was just too good a question to pass up. And we know that you're working on a project right now with Walt Disney. And these students were asking, can you talk a little bit about how Walt Disney was a leader? And I think this can be helpful to our other students to hear what you would think about this question, because they're thinking about their leaders and saying, okay, how are they a leader and what kind of legacy did they leave? So can you give us a quick version? I'm going to kind of put you on the spot here on your thoughts on Walt Disney as a leader.
Well, it's interesting because, I went from Henry Ford, and then I'm working on a film about Walt Disney, and in some ways there are similarities. I think Walt Disney had something that a lot of people who we call leaders, visionaries have, which is that he had a great sense of self-confidence about what he wanted to do, and he had a sense that his vision was the right vision. And so that helped him to sell his ideas. And whether he was selling his ideas to really talented artists who were going to help him make his films and make Snow White and Pinocchio and Dumbo and Fantasia and Bambi a possibility, he was selling him his vision, and he was very charming and charismatic when he wanted to do that, and he really got people on board with his self-confidence. At the same time, he really wasn't interested in other people's ideas that didn't serve his vision. So he was very narrowly focused on what he wanted to do. So you could really, and I think we're exploring this within the project, was what does this incredibly charming, charismatic side of selling, being really excited about your vision, but is there a downside when you're so narrowly focused and you're so only looking through the tunnel of what you want to do? Does that cause problems for a leader like Walt Disney?
Well, I think that's a great idea, and that definitely gave some really good tips to many of our students out there. Well, we're approaching the top of the next hour, so we're going to go and wrap things up now. First off, I need to say a big, big thank you to our students who joined us from Mrs. Langey's class in Oahu, Hawaii, from Ms. Roper's class in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Thank you so much to our NHD affiliate coordinators, Maggie Mahan in Missouri, Millie Freese in Iowa. And what I'm going to do now is turn things over to wrap it up to Karen Kenton at the NEH. But thank you so very much, Sarah Colt, for taking your time tonight, and not just tonight, but being with our students and also really preparing, because there's a lot that goes into this. So I'll turn things over to you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Lynn. This has been a really exciting evening. Sarah, thanks so much for sharing your insights, and to everyone for being here. We have a resource page up with the webinar link, or the Hangout link, I should call it, so you can access some of the things we talked about tonight: Excitement, Chronicling America, a link to the Henry Ford film that's streaming on American Experience, and even links to our summer programs that we offer to teachers. There are institutes who get stipends to attend 1 to 5 week courses. The deadline for that is March 2nd, so teachers out there, I recommend that you check that out. And I just wanted to also acknowledge our state humanities councils. Many participate in National History Day, and many also offer educational resources. So good luck to all you History Day students. Hope to see you in Maryland in June. And even if I don't, you're all NEH.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great night.